I often find myself thinking back to the early days of Robert and me. Before the distance, before the silence. When we first met, he was nothing like the man I know now. No, he was someone more tender, more eager to be part of my life. I was 23, unsure of so many things, when he walked into my world with that quiet confidence only a soldier could possess. He had a way of making everything feel certain, secure. It was easy to fall for him. Our wedding was a small affair, only close friends and family. I could see the future so clearly then. Our life would be filled with love, kids, a home. Simple, uncomplicated. But I didn't know back then how much I would have to share him with the world, how many years I would spend alone, waiting for his return, watching my life grow while his stayed static. His job was the priority. And I was just the one who waited. We built a life together, or at least I thought we did. The first years of our marriage, before the children, were full of spontaneous laughter, quiet nights, and conversations that made me feel like we were growing together. But then Robert's career took over. It always did. He was promoted quickly, advancing in ways I barely understood, and with every promotion came more responsibility, longer deployments, more time away. I learned to live with it, or at least I convinced myself I had. Robert's absence became a pattern I had no choice but to follow. I would hold the fort, raise the children, pretend that everything was fine. But it wasn't fine. It was lonely. I had children to care for, but the emotional void left by Robert's absence, by his ever-diminishing presence, was a burden too heavy to carry alone. Lily came first, a beautiful little girl with my eyes and Robert's smile. Max followed 2 years later, a curious, energetic boy who seemed to remind me, daily, how precious time was. The days passed in a blur of diapers, bottles, school runs. I dedicated myself to them. It was what Robert wanted, what he needed, stability. But as much as I loved our children, as much as they filled my heart, there was always a part of me that was still reaching for something. Reaching for him. Robert would come home, of course, but it was never enough. He'd walk in, and there would be that brief reunion, the hugs, the excitement. But the moments always felt too short, like I was holding my breath, afraid to let go. Then he'd leave again, and I would pick up the pieces. Always the pieces. Underscore 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 underscore. As Robert rose through the ranks, I knew the life we'd chosen was inevitable. The missions got longer, more intense. He'd come back with stories I didn't always understand, places I couldn't even locate on a map. His eyes would darken as he spoke of his work, and I learned not to ask too many questions. The promotions, the accolades, they meant something to him. And I, ever supportive, cheered him on, even as I felt myself growing smaller in his shadow. The man who had once held me with such tenderness now seemed more like a figurehead in our own home. I started to wonder if the love we once shared was fading into something else, something quieter, something more distant. When Robert left for Africa, it felt like my whole world shifted. 6 months. 6 months. The thought of it was unbearable at first. But I told myself it would be temporary, just a small sacrifice for the greater good. His mission was important, vital, and I had to be strong. I had to hold it together for him, for our family. The first few days, I was okay. I kept busy with the kids, the house, the usual routine. But as the days wore on, the loneliness set in. I started to realize how much of my life revolved around waiting for Robert. His phone calls became my lifeline. At first, they came regularly, every day, like clockwork, but slowly, the calls became less frequent, more distant. "Sorry, Mary Lou, the mission's demanding," Robert would say. "I'll call as soon as I can." The excuses were subtle at first, but I could hear the strain in his voice, the exhaustion that hadn't been there before. As the calls began to dwindle, the silence between us grew louder. I couldn't keep pretending everything was fine. I needed something to distract me from the gnawing emptiness, so I threw myself into the garden. It was something I had always meant to do, but had never found the time for. Now, it felt like a small escape, a way to stay connected to life while everything else seemed to fall apart. And then, there was Javier. He was hired to work on the garden, just another task to fill the void. He was young, polite, and surprisingly attentive. At first, it was just work. He trimmed the hedges, planted flowers, watered the lawn. But slowly, he became a presence in my life I didn't know I needed. The days spent with him felt easier. We talked about the weather, about plants, and about our lives. I didn't expect the connection to grow so quickly, but it did. With the kids at school, it was just us. I found myself looking forward to his visits, the sound of his voice breaking the silence in the house. He wasn't Robert, and yet, for the first time in a long while, I didn't feel so alone. I tried not to think too much about it, telling myself it was harmless. But as the days passed, the line between friendly conversation and something more blurred. Javier made me laugh, made me feel seen in a way Robert hadn't in months. It was easy, too easy, to let myself slip further into this new reality. And that, more than anything, terrified me. But Robert was still on the other side of the world, his calls growing less frequent, his presence more distant. I was left to fill the empty spaces however I could. I wasn't sure what I expected when the gardening company sent Javier. The previous gardener had been unreliable, and I had put off finding a replacement for far too long. The garden was becoming a mess, unruly, wild, and I couldn't stand it. It was supposed to be my sanctuary, but the neglected corners seemed to mirror my own life, growing wild in ways I couldn't control. When Javier arrived, I was taken aback. He wasn't what I had imagined. He was younger than I expected, maybe in his late 20s, with dark eyes that had an intensity to them and a quiet confidence that seemed to fill the space around him. There was a calmness in his demeanor that was immediately disarming. He wasn't just doing a job, he was present in a way that felt different from anyone else who had worked on the house. He introduced himself with a warm, easy smile. His handshake was firm, but not too much, respectful. It was clear he had been raised well, had a kind of polish about him that surprised me. I wasn't sure why, but I found myself watching him more than I should have. The first day, we hardly spoke. He was focused, moving through the yard with practiced ease, trimming the hedges and planting flowers with the care of someone who genuinely enjoyed his work. I wandered between the kids' routines, occasionally glancing out the window to see how he was doing. It wasn't until the second day that we really started talking. It was small talk at first: weather, the types of plants I preferred, how the soil was holding up in the drought. It wasn't much, but it was enough to make me feel seen again. Robert's absence had left a gaping hole in my day-to-day life, and somehow, Javier's steady presence filled it, even if just for a few hours. He made no demands, didn't try to rush through his tasks. It was like he was in no hurry, letting the hours stretch out in a way that felt comfortable. The third day, I found myself offering him iced tea, just a small gesture. It seemed like the polite thing to do, and he accepted it with a nod of gratitude. He thanked me for the drink and then went right back to work, but this time, there was an ease between us, a familiarity, as if we'd known each other longer than we actually had. "What kind of flowers do you like?" he asked, while carefully planting new roses along the fence. "Roses and daisies," I answered, distracted by the way he moved, the way his hands worked the earth with such intention. "They're pretty," he said, offering me a brief smile. "Daisies are simple but strong. You seem like someone who appreciates that." I didn't know why, but his words struck me, as though he had somehow seen a side of me that had been buried under years of routine and responsibilities. It was a simple compliment, but it made me feel something, a stir of warmth, perhaps, or just the feeling of being noticed in a way I hadn't been in a long time. As the days went by, I looked forward to his visits. Javier was always punctual, arriving around 9 a.m. when the kids were at school. I would be in the kitchen, starting my day with a cup of coffee, but there was a sense of anticipation that settled in me whenever I heard his truck pull up. We spoke more each time, about our lives, his childhood, my children, the routines that seemed to tie us both to our separate worlds. There was a lightness to our conversations, something easy and casual that I hadn't realized I was missing. In those moments, I could almost forget the ache of Robert's absence, the silence of our strained marriage. It wasn't long before I started to feel seen by Javier, in ways I hadn't felt seen by Robert in months. He didn't carry the weight of the military with him, the burden of being a soldier who always had one foot out the door. He was just there, with me. And it felt good. Too good. On the days when he worked, it wasn't just the flowers I was tending to. It was the space around us, the ease in the air, the way his presence in the yard made the loneliness in my house seem less oppressive. The more time we spent together, the more I found myself waiting for him. And the more I realized I needed those moments. Little did I know, this was only the beginning. The days spent with Javier started to blur together. I was caught in a strange rhythm, one that was defined by the hours spent working in the garden, the quiet exchanges between us, and the growing sense of connection I couldn't ignore. It began to feel like a routine I didn't want to break. Every morning, after the kids were off to school, I'd step outside to find Javier already at work, his presence grounding me in a way I hadn't known in years. We were never just working in silence anymore. Our conversations grew longer, more personal, filled with little details about our lives. He'd tell me about his family, his hopes, his past, and I'd share bits and pieces of my own. There was something about the way he listened, so fully, so attentively, that made me feel as though I mattered again. It was different from the way Robert listened, distracted, always thinking about the next mission or the next phone call. It wasn't just about the gardening anymore. Our conversations wandered into topics I hadn't expected. We spoke about the little things, like favorite movies or childhood memories. Sometimes, Javier would share a laugh with me, and I'd find myself laughing harder than I had in a long time, as if the weight of the past few months had suddenly lifted, even if just for a moment. I started to look forward to these afternoons more than I should have. His presence in my life was easy, uncomplicated. Javier wasn't asking for anything, he just existed in this space, a temporary fixture in a world that felt too heavy. But as the days turned into weeks, I noticed how my emotions were shifting, how the subtle spark between us began to change into something more. I could see it in the way he'd glance at me when he thought I wasn't looking, or in the soft, almost imperceptible smile he gave when I said something that made him think. It wasn't just friendly anymore. There was an unspoken tension, a thread running between us that had been there all along, even if I hadn't wanted to admit it. He never crossed any lines, never made me feel uncomfortable, but there was something in the way he'd stand a little too close when handing me tools, or how our hands would brush when passing each other small items. It wasn't the touch of a stranger or even that of a friend, it was something else, something warmer, more intimate. And every time it happened, my heart would race a little faster, my breath would catch in my throat. But I didn't stop it. I didn't pull away. Some days, we would take a break together, sitting on the porch with our drinks, watching the kids' toys scattered across the yard. He'd ask about Robert, always curious about how he was doing and how I was managing without him. I told him the truth, how lonely I was, how I missed the companionship, that connection I once had with Robert before everything had become so distant. I get it, Javier would say. It's hard, being alone. But you're strong. You've been holding it together for so long. I'd smile at him, grateful for his words. He was the first person in a long time who understood the weight of my days. And it felt like a balm to the ache in my chest, the ache that had grown with each passing day that Robert remained halfway across the world, leaving me behind. But as much as I told myself this was harmless, just two people talking, passing the time, it wasn't. I knew it. Javier's presence was starting to fill the gaps Robert had left, and I was letting it happen. It was becoming harder to ignore the feelings I had for him, the pull that was growing stronger by the day. I knew something had shifted between us, but I didn't know how to stop it. All I could do was hold on to it, let it grow, and hope that somehow, when Robert came back, things would return to normal. But in the back of my mind, I knew it was already too late. It started slowly. One afternoon, as I was standing beside Javier in the garden, the air between us felt different. The sun was beginning to dip, casting a soft golden light across the yard, and for the first time in weeks, I felt seen, truly seen. Javier was focused on trimming the edges of the hedge, but when he glanced up at me, our eyes locked in a way that made my breath catch. He smiled, but it wasn't the same casual smile he'd offered before. This one was different. There was a quiet intensity behind it, something deeper, something more meaningful. And for a moment, I felt the stirrings of something I couldn't explain, a shift inside me that made my heart race. I told myself it was nothing. Just a moment. But that evening, after he left and I was alone in the silence of the house, I couldn't stop thinking about it. I thought about how our conversations had evolved, how our time together felt easier, warmer. I thought about the way his touch lingered just a second too long when passing me tools or handing me the watering can. I thought about how my heart responded to him in ways I hadn't expected. Then, that night, Robert called. The conversation was short, strained even, and I couldn't help but feel a disconnect in his voice. It wasn't the same. He told me he missed me, but there was a distance there I couldn't ignore. And that was when I realized I had started looking for something more. Something that Robert couldn't give me from half a world away. I could feel it now, the shift. And I was helpless to stop it. Javier wasn't just a distraction anymore. He was something else, something I wasn't ready to admit. And yet, as the days passed, I couldn't deny that I was already slipping deeper into this new reality with him, one where the loneliness faded with every moment spent together. It was a line I couldn't uncross. And in the quiet of the garden, I was beginning to wonder if I even wanted to. The day Robert returned was meant to be a surprise. He called just once that morning, his voice sounding a little more upbeat than usual, as if he were trying to mask the exhaustion that had been building up over months. "I'll be home before you know it, Mary Lou. I can't wait to see you," he said, the words carrying a sense of finality I hadn't heard in his tone before. I hung up the phone, feeling a mix of relief and dread. I didn't know how to prepare for his return. The house was clean, the kids were excited, but my mind, my thoughts, kept drifting back to the garden. To Javier. The steady rhythm of our daily exchanges. The soft laughter. The subtle touches. I didn't know what to expect when Robert walked through the door, but I knew this. Things between us were different. I had no idea how much Robert had changed. He came home early, unexpectedly, just as I was outside in the garden, the familiar scent of earth and flowers surrounding me. I was bending over a patch of soil, my hands covered in dirt, when I heard the unmistakable sound of his boots on the driveway. My heart skipped a beat. I turned toward the house, knowing that once I saw him, there would be no turning back. But it wasn't just him I saw. Robert's gaze locked onto us, me and Javier, in the garden. I froze, the tension so thick I could feel it in my chest. Javier was just a few feet away, bending to pick up a tool I'd dropped. Our eyes met briefly, and I could see his hesitation. He knew. He must have known. But Robert, his face was stone. I watched the muscles in his jaw tighten, his entire body going rigid. The smile on his face faltered, replaced by something colder, more dangerous. And in that moment, the reality of what had been happening settled over me like a weight I couldn't shake. Robert didn't say anything at first. He just stood there, his eyes flicking back and forth between me and Javier, his breathing growing heavier with each passing second. Then, his voice broke the silence. "What the hell is going on here?" I could barely breathe, let alone answer. I wanted to speak, to explain, but the words caught in my throat. Everything I had been hiding, everything I had been trying to ignore, was out in the open now. I didn't know what Robert would do next. And in that instant, I feared that nothing between us would ever be the same again. The hours that followed Robert's return were a blur. The silence in the house was deafening, thick with tension. After the confrontation in the garden, Robert had dragged Javier inside. I tried to stop him, to explain, but the fury in Robert's eyes made my words die in my throat. I had never seen him like this. His face, red with anger, was almost unrecognizable. "Leave." "Now," Robert growled at Javier, his voice low but filled with menace. Javier hesitated for a moment, his eyes flicking between Robert and me, but he knew better than to argue. He turned and walked out, his steps heavy with regret. I stayed frozen by the door, too afraid to move, too ashamed to look at Robert. He didn't shout. He didn't need to. His silence was far worse than any words he could have said. It was the cold, calculated kind of silence that spoke of a rage I couldn't control. Once the door shut behind Javier, Robert's fury turned on me. "How long?" he asked, his voice dangerously calm. "How long has this been going on?" I wanted to tell him everything, how I'd felt so alone, how Javier had become a kind of anchor in the storm I'd been living in, but the truth, in all its rawness, felt like it would shatter us completely. I looked at Robert, seeing the man who had once been my partner, my love, but who now seemed like a stranger. He didn't wait for an answer. Instead, he grabbed my arm roughly and led me to the living room, forcing me to sit. His anger had quieted, but his eyes, those eyes, spoke volumes. "I can't believe you did this," he whispered, his voice breaking for the first time. "I trusted you, Mary Lou." I couldn't speak. I felt the weight of my betrayal, the guilt pressing down on me, suffocating me. I had never intended for this to happen, but now, in the quiet aftermath, it felt as though the damage was irreparable. In the following days, Robert tried to act as though everything would be okay. He apologized for his absence, for not being there when I needed him. But the truth hung between us like a thick fog, suffocating any attempts at normalcy. He never raised a hand to me, but I could feel the change in him. The fear I had of him, the way his anger simmered just below the surface, made me shrink into myself. I stopped speaking as freely, stopped offering the little parts of myself that I had once given so openly. The spark that had once been between us was gone, replaced by something much colder. The worst part was the silence. It was as if we were both too afraid to speak about what had happened. Robert never said it outright, but I could feel his disappointment like a weight in every word he spoke. And me? I felt as though I had lost myself entirely. Robert didn't leave. He promised not to travel again, said he would make this work. But I knew, deep down, that nothing would ever be the same. My heart ached for the connection we had once shared, but it seemed so distant now, something I could never reach again. And as I looked at Robert, I couldn't help but feel small. He had forgiven me, but the fear in his eyes told me that I had crossed a line that could never truly be erased. And I would never be the same either.
If you like this story and felt connected, please subscribe. Thanks for watching Gaby's cheating stories. See you on the next one.